I wanted to tell you a couple of stories about Richard Nixon, because he's a famous American politician. I was the Reuters correspondent in Vietnam in 1967, and I was living in the Da Nang Press Centre covering the US Marines, and one day they said Richard Nixon, who stood against Kennedy and lost, has come out to Vietnam to have a look around. He's going on a flight over Dong Ha and places along the southern side of the DMZ. So myself and I think it was Tom Corper of UPI and probably John Lendl of AP, we rushed out to the airport. And when we got there was Tricky Dicky, as they called him. He was standing at the bottom of the stairs to get onto this aeroplane. And so we grabbed our notebooks and rushed over, and he said, "Sorry fellas, the press can't, as I told everyone, they haven't got me to kick around anymore. I'm just a private citizen, a lawyer. I've come to have a look around my own accord, so I'm not giving interviews." And so we said, "Oh, right, okay." And anyway, the plane wasn't due to take off, so we stood around chatting for a while, and we were telling him, as we all knew, how badly the war was going and how hopeless it all was, and how the North Vietnamese were in the demilitarised zone and they were bombarding Dong Ha, artillerying it, giving it artillery, or red legs as the Americans called it, nearly every day. So we said, it's going badly, and he said, "Well, I'm going to have a look, but it seems sensible to me that if you're getting hit with artillery from North Vietnam, you just send some troops to land above them in North Vietnam and go in and get them." And we thought, well, that's very interesting. Nobody thought that was a possibility without starting World War III, but anyway, he was very nice to us, very quietly spoken. He was much nicer than I'd expected, having supported President Kennedy against him, or wanting Kennedy to win. So I never ran into him again, but in 1969 I was the Reuters correspondent in Indonesia, and there was going to be an act of free choice, so-called, for the western half of the island of New Guinea. The western half of the island of New Guinea is the size of France and is full of, the Americans have big mines there, copper, gold, silver, Freeport, and it's got oil, and it's on the equator, but got permanently snow-capped, ice-capped mountains, and very few people had ever been there. And the reason they needed an act of free choice was that Holland and Indonesia actually went to war in 1962, and the Dutch sent an aircraft carrier out and they sank an Indonesian boat with President Sukarno's nephew, who was killed on board. And so the Americans stepped in, and Ellsworth Bunker, who was later their ambassador to Vietnam, drafted a peace in which they agreed under United Nations accords that Indonesia could look after West Papua, the western half of New Guinea, which they had always claimed because Sukarno said that anything that was Dutch is ours, and whereas the Papuans said, no, we don't want to be part of Indonesia. So the accords said that if Indonesia looks after them for 7 years, and then we hold an act of free choice, and then the 800,000 Papuans of West Papua, Irian Barat at the time it was called, they can make their own choice under the Act of Free Choice. So that was to be held because there were no roads, and it had to be there were 8 province capitals where they had to have a vote. It was going to take 6 weeks in July, August 69. So in May 69, the world's media demanded the right to go there because no one had been there for 7 years, and they wanted to preview it. So all the famous American and English correspondents who were based in Asia, based in Singapore, based in Bangkok, based in Hong Kong, based in Jakarta, a whole plane load went over to preview the Act of Free Choice in May. But when the Act of Free Choice was actually held, none of them went. Now, why didn't they go? Well, I was sitting at my desk in the beginning of July 1969, and I worked where the telex machine was around in another corner, and someone brought me around a telex, and I read it, and it was from Reuters in Singapore, the Singapore manager saying, "Stay at your desk, do not go to West Papua. President Nixon has just been announced is going to tour Southeast Asia for the 3 weeks that the main part of the Act of Free Choice. So all correspondents are staying where they are." Now, if anything happens to the president, if he trips over and hurts his toe, the stock exchange collapses, and you know, news agencies are about making money, and that's big news. So everyone, I realised, would all be told to stay where they were, and they were all told to stay where they were. That's why they didn't go. So I got the telex and thought, I've been writing about this for 6 months, and now no one's going to go and see what happens. So I put the telex down, grabbed my car keys, rushed home, got a Qantas bag, threw some clothes in. I forgot to put in a spare pair of shoes, so for the next 6 weeks in the tropics I wore a pair of sand shoes, one pair of sand shoes day and night, and went out to the airport and caught the plane to Biak, 2,000 miles away on the island of West Papua, to cover the Act of Free Choice. So I could see why they didn't want the reporters there, because it wasn't an Act of Free Choice at all. They held it in 8 province capitals. Only myself and a Dutch journalist, Otto Kalk, who's now dead, covered the whole 8. A few people covered the first one, and Peter Hastings, 3 of the 8, who came in from Australia and New Guinea. And so they selected in each of the province capitals just over 100 people who they wanted, and they had to vote in buildings that were surrounded by Indonesian troops and armoured personnel carriers, and in Manokwari, when people yelled out "Sendiri, Sendiri," which meant alone, alone, I watched them bashed up and thrown on the back of trucks. So that's why the United States and President Nixon didn't want the world's press to be there. Thank you.